Hello to the Realtors of the Johnston County Association. My name is Will Martin and I'm delighted to be here with you today via video as counsel for the North Carolina Realtors. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so sharing some information on 6 topics that I thought might be of interest to you, 3 of which are new or relatively new, and 3 of which are issues that have been around for a while, but that my partners and I regularly get questions about on the hotline. The topics I'm going to cover are 1, a new NCR form called the Overview of Standard Contract, 2, what form a buyer should use to terminate a contract prior to the end of the due diligence period, 3, assistance animals, 4, a new obligation to confirm that an offer has been presented, 5, the elimination of the contingent sale addendum, and last but not least, 6, how to handle a delay in the delivery of the due diligence fee. If you have any questions about any of these topics, please feel free to contact the NC Realtors Legal Hotline, which is a service that's available on an unlimited basis to all Realtor members of NCR as a part of your state association dues. The hotline number is 336-294-1415, and the address for email questions is legalhotline@ncrealtors.org. Also, we've written articles about most, if not all, of these topics, and if you're interested in reading an article on these and many other topics, you can find it in the archived Q&As on the NC Realtors website at www.ncrealtors.org. I'd like to tell you about a new form that's been added to the NC Realtors Forms Library. I can hear you now. Another form? Well, this one's a little different from our other forms, both in its content and format, and it represents a collaborative effort of the NC Realtors Forms Committee and the NC Realtors Communications and Marketing Department. The name of the form is the Overview of Standard Contract, which is not a particularly snappy name, but I think it's going to be very well received because it's an attractive looking document that summarizes some of the most important aspects of the contract and the contract process in consumer-friendly language that your clients and you might actually enjoy reading. Topics that the overview addresses include contract formation, earnest money, the due diligence process, the buyer's sale of other property, financing, and closing. The overview has also been translated into Spanish, and depending on demand, it's possible it'll be translated into other languages too. We've put the form in the 700 series, which are the miscellaneous forms. Both the English and Spanish versions are listed as form number 780, and both are available now in zip forms and on the NCAR website. My partners and I regularly get questions on the hotline about what form should be used to notify the seller that the buyer has decided to terminate the contract before the end of the due diligence period. There are 2 different forms that would work. One is the notice to seller that buyer is exercising their unilateral right to terminate the offer to purchase and contract. That's form 350-T. And the other is the termination of contract by mutual agreement with release of earnest money. That's form 390-T. The question is, which one should be used? We generally recommend you use form 350-T. Either form would work, but 350-T only requires the buyer's signature to accomplish the termination, while form 390-T requires signatures by both the buyer and the seller to be effective. If you transmit a form 390-T that's been signed by the buyer to the listing agent, and for some reason the seller fails to sign it before the end of the due diligence period, an argument can be made that the buyer was offering to terminate the contract on certain terms, and since the seller didn't accept the buyer's offer by signing the form, the contract was not terminated before the end of the due diligence period, and the buyer is not entitled to a refund of their earnest money deposit if they don't complete the transaction. On the other hand, Form 350-T is designed for the buyer to exercise their unilateral right to terminate the contract for any reason or no reason during the due diligence period. It's true that there's a place for the seller to sign on the second page of Form 350-T, but that's simply an authorization to the escrow agent to return the earnest money deposit to the buyer. Transmitting a signed Form 350-T to the listing agent before the end of the due diligence period effectively terminates the contract. The seller's failure to sign the second page doesn't change that, although it could potentially cause a delay in the return of the earnest money deposit. Form 390-T is a very useful form that can be used to terminate a contract by mutual consent in many different situations, including this one. However, since time is of the essence regarding the end of the due diligence period, we think Form 350-T is the better form to use in this situation, given the critical importance of timely and clearly notifying the seller of the buyer's decision to terminate the contract. What are your obligations under the fair housing laws if someone requests to have an animal as a reasonable accommodation? According to guidance on the subject from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, that was published on January 28, 2020, complaints involving requests for assistance animals are significantly increasing, and overall, 60% of all fair housing complaints concern denial of reasonable accommodations and disability access. The question about animals is certainly one that we are fielding more and more on the legal hotline. This new guidance replaces guidance HUD published in 2013 on housing providers' obligations regarding service animals and assistance animals. I don't think the new guidance reflects any fundamental changes in HUD's position on the subject of service and assistance animals, but there is some new information in the recent guidance that I think is helpful, including a set of best practices regarding the type and amount of documentation a housing provider may ask for. A few words about terminology. The term service animal is a term that's used in connection with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. The ADA concerns the accommodation of disabilities in places of public accommodation, like a real estate broker's office, while the fair housing laws are concerned with the accommodation of disabilities in residential housing. The new HUD guidance lumps service animals in with other types of trained or untrained animals that do work, perform tasks, provide assistance, and/or provide therapeutic emotional support for individuals with disabilities, and it refers to them all as assistance animals. The basic rule is that a person with a disability and a disability-related need for an assistance animal who requests, either orally or in writing, to have an assistance animal is entitled to keep the animal, even if there's a no pets policy. An assistance animal is not considered to be a pet, and a housing provider can't charge the disabled person a pet fee or pet deposit, but can charge for damage an assistance animal causes. If both the disability and the disability-related need for the animal are readily apparent, the housing provider can't ask for further information. An example would be a blind person with a guide dog. On the other hand, if the disability and the disability-related need for the animal are not readily apparent to a layperson, the housing provider may request information regarding both the disability and the disability-related need for the animal. However, the housing provider is not entitled to know an individual's diagnosis. Information about a disability and the disability-related need for an assistance animal can be provided by a quote-unquote healthcare professional. The HUD guidance lists several examples of a healthcare professional, including a physician, optometrist, psychiatrist, psychologist, physician's assistant, nurse, practitioner, and nurse. The new guidance also addresses a common source of questions we get on the legal hotline, that is, documentation obtained on the internet. I'm going to read what the guidance has to say on the subject because I think it's instructive, and I'm quoting, "Some websites sell certificates, registrations, and licensing documents for assistance animals to anyone who answers certain questions or participates in a short interview and pays a fee. Under the Fair Housing Act, a housing provider may request reliable documentation when an individual requesting a reasonable accommodation has a disability and disability-related need for an accommodation that are not obvious or otherwise known. In HUD's experience, such documentation from the Internet is not by itself sufficient to reliably establish that an individual has a non-observable disability or disability-related need for an assistance animal. By contrast, many legitimate licensed healthcare professionals deliver services remotely, including over the Internet. One reliable form of documentation is a note from a person's healthcare professional that confirms a person's disability and/or need for an animal when the provider has personal knowledge of the individual. End of quote. My interpretation of what I just read is that it's okay for a housing provider to be suspicious of Internet documentation, but if the documentation establishes that the professional has personal knowledge of the individual, it likely will be considered reliable. There is also some interesting discussion in the guidance on what sorts of animals must be permitted. Generally, the animal must be one that is commonly kept in households. Animals listed in the guidance as common household animals include a dog, cat, small bird, rabbit, hamster, gerbil, other rodent, fish, turtle, or other small domesticated animal that is traditionally kept in the home for pleasure rather than commercial purposes. On the other hand, you'll be happy to know that HUD does not consider reptiles, other than turtles, barnyard animals, monkeys, kangaroos, and other non-domesticated animals to be common household animals. Note, though, that unique types of animals not commonly kept in households may potentially qualify as an assistance animal under unusual circumstances. An example is given in the guidance of a trained monkey who performs tasks for a person with paralysis caused by a spinal cord injury that can't be performed by a dog, including retrieving a bottle from the refrigerator, unscrewing the cap, inserting a straw, and placing the bottle in a holder so the individual can get a drink of water. The last thing I'll mention is that the new guidance confirms that a housing provider may refuse a reasonable accommodation request if the specific animal poses a direct threat to the health or safety of other individuals, or which would result in substantial physical damage to the property of others. In the interest of time, I'm not going to cover everything in the guidance, and I encourage you to take the time to read it yourself, especially if you do any property management. If you haven't gotten a request for an assistance animal yet, you'll probably will sometime soon. The new guidance won't answer all of the questions that may come up, but I think you'll find it useful. I'd like to spend a few minutes highlighting a relatively new provision in the Realtor Code of Ethics that you need to be aware of. Let's say you've submitted an offer for your buyer client on another realtor's listing 3 days ago. You've left several voicemail messages on the listing agent's cell phone, but you haven't heard anything back yet, and you and your client are both anxious. The question is the listing agent required to confirm that your client's offer has been presented? The answer now is yes, if you request confirmation in writing. Effective January 1st of 2019, Standard of Practice 1-7 of the Realtor Code of Ethics was revised to provide that a listing agent must, upon the written request of a cooperating agent who submits an offer to the listing agent, provide a written affirmation to the cooperating agent stating that the offer has been submitted to the seller. Failure to provide written affirmation would subject the listing agent to potential discipline by his or her local association of realtors for violating Article 1 of the Code of Ethics. A related issue is the listing agent's obligation to present the offer itself. A real estate commission rule states that an offer has to be presented within 3 days, and failure to do so could subject the listing agent to discipline by the commission. An agent's failure to timely present an offer could also subject him or her to discipline by his or her local association of realtors for violating Article 1 of the Code of Ethics as illustrated by Standard of Practice 1-6. Standard of Practice 1-6 states that realtors shall submit offers and counteroffers objectively and as quickly as possible. The contingent sale addendum was eliminated as a standard form effective July 1, 2019. The question is why? For one thing, the form was confusing. Agents misunderstood and misused it for many years, or used it without fully understanding what rights it gave the parties and what obligations it imposed on them. For another thing, the idea that the buyer should have the right to terminate the contract after the end of the due diligence period if their existing property doesn't sell and get a full refund of their earnest money deposit is inconsistent with the philosophy of the due diligence contract. The due diligence contract gives the parties the ability to negotiate a point in time, that point being the date the due diligence period ends. Up until that point in time, the buyer has the right to terminate the contract for any reason or no reason. However, after that point in time, the buyer risks the loss of their earnest money deposit if the buyer is unable to complete the transaction. Under the due diligence contract, the seller isn't penalized if, after the end of the due diligence period, the buyer's lender fails to approve the loan for some unforeseen reason. The transaction doesn't close, which isn't good for anybody, but at least the seller gets to keep the earnest money deposit to partially compensate them for the time the property has been off the market. Similarly, the seller shouldn't bear the risk after the end of the due diligence period of the buyer not being able to complete the transaction because they can't get their existing property closed. We believe that if a buyer and a seller want to enter into a contract where the buyer needs to sell an existing property before they can close on the seller's property, the parties and their agents should be able to use the due diligence contract to negotiate contract terms, including the price of the property, the length of the due diligence period, the amounts of the due diligence fee and earnest money deposit, and the settlement date that will allow the buyer to either close on their existing property before the end of the due diligence period or give the buyer the ability to determine whether they are reasonably confident that they will be able to close on their existing property before the settlement date in the contract with the seller. We also hope that eliminating the addendum will encourage agents to do a more thorough job on the front end before the parties go under contract in gathering information about the buyer's property and any contract on the buyer's property and assessing the chances that the buyer's existing property will sell and or close during a time frame acceptable to both parties. Is the buyer's property in a desirable location? Is it priced correctly? If it's under contract, does the buyer's buyer also have to sell in order to buy? We believe it's important for agents, listing agents and buyer agents alike, to be asking these kinds of questions and not simply relying on the contingent sale addendum to sort things out if the buyer's property doesn't get sold and or closed. Portions of the old contingent sale addendum have been incorporated into paragraph 5 of the offer to purchase and contract. However, it is very important to understand that there is no legal contingency in the contract that would allow the buyer to get their earnest money deposit back if they are unable to complete the transaction with the seller and the due diligence period has ended. We understand that the elimination of the contingent sale addendum represents a change for those realtors who have been accustomed to using it. Change is not always easy or appreciated. However, numerous realtors have told us that they have learned how to use the terms of the due diligence contract to handle situations where the buyer needs to sell an existing property and that they didn't use the contingent sale addendum in such situations. We believe that with time, the elimination of this confusing form will be beneficial to our members and their clients. John, Bill, and I get quite a few questions on the hotline from listing agents who want to know what their options are when there has been a delay in delivery of the due diligence fee. One recent caller wanted to know if he could refuse to deliver a completely signed offer until the due diligence fee was paid. We didn't recommend to the caller that he trade a signed contract for the buyer's due diligence fee. The offer to purchase and contract provides that the offer becomes a contract when it's signed and the signing is communicated to the offering party. Assuming that the listing agent has communicated to the buyer's agent that the seller has signed the offer, it would be incorrect to think that holding on to the signed contract until the due diligence fee has been delivered has any legal effect on the validity of the contract. And even if you think that holding on to the signed contract might give the seller some practical advantage, an argument can be made that intentionally delaying the delivery of a signed contract is a violation of the license law, which provides that a broker can be disciplined for, quote, failing to deliver within a reasonable time a completed copy of any purchase agreement or offer to buy and sell real estate to the buyer and the seller, end of quote. Paragraph 1D of the contract allows a seller to terminate a contract if the due diligence fee isn't timely delivered following 1 banking day's written notice. Our recommendation is that listing agents should utilize this mechanism aggressively if there is any delay at all in the delivery of the due diligence fee, which, as you know, is due on the effective date of the contract. Form 355T can be used to put the buyer on notice of the seller's intent to terminate, and if the due diligence fee isn't delivered within 1 banking day, Form 352T or 353T if the property is vacant land can be used to terminate the contract. The seller is legally entitled to the due diligence fee, although it must be said that they may never actually get it, given the practical issues involved in filing a suit. But even if the seller never gets the due diligence fee, at least the seller can minimize the time that their property is off the market by promptly terminating the contract if the due diligence fee isn't timely paid. Well, that wraps up my remarks for today. Thanks so much for your attention. I hope that this has been helpful. Don't hesitate to contact my partners and me if you have any questions about any of the topics I've covered today or any other topics related to your real estate practice. Have a good day.